Welcome to History's Influence. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the greatest military tacticians in history, but what he had just accomplished had even left himself awestruck. Many stood in his way and many fell. 5 separate coalitions of European nations could not stop his domination of the continent. Napoleon had now ventured east and accomplished an incredible feat that could only be compared to Alexander the Great's deeds. The emperor looked upon the city, his city, for he had conquered what many would consider the center of the world. He had conquered the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople. It now appeared that the world would be within his grasp. But looks can be deceiving. This video will be seeing what would have happened if Napoleon worked together with Russia to try to conquer the Ottoman Empire, instead of fighting a catastrophic campaign against Russia. To see how Constantinople was captured, you'll have to watch the US of Z's video, the first portion in this 2-part collaboration. This video is instead going to take a look at the ramifications of such a conquest. Would the successful war alleviate the concerns Russia had, which caused them to betray France in our own timeline? Would Napoleon's domination of Europe therefore be assured? Would he go on to conquer further east, finishing the remnants of the Ottomans? Or would everything collapse in on itself, like a house of cards? All these questions and more will be answered in this alternate history. With the Ottomans defeated in Europe, Napoleonic France and Russia would divide up the spoils at a conference centered in Scutari. Satellite states for France, known as sister duchies and kingdoms, will be formed in regions such as Bosnia, Serbia, and Western Greece. Sister kingdoms used to be sister republics, attempting to spread the liberalism of the French Revolution. Whilst revolutionary ideals were still spread across such client states, Napoleon's siblings were placed upon their thrones for a more despotic leadership. Russia would instead be acquiring lands directly. Bulgaria, the region of Thrace, including Constantinople, will be annexed. In addition, Eastern Anatolia and Armenia will be acquired. The Russians won't wish to expand into Anatolia by this point. They were seen as Christian liberators for the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Armenians, but this won't be the case for the Islamic Turks. As a side note, many Muslims in new Russian regions will flee to Anatolia, and a reverse movement of Christians may also occur in succession. Anyway, there's also the potential for a drawn-out guerrilla conflict in rough terrain, namely the Anatolian Mountains, Central Plateau, and narrow choke points. Taking Anatolia also won't substantially boost naval and trade access. So, the Russians would now dominate the Black Sea and have access to the Mediterranean Sea. The Ottoman Sultan and his court will be fleeing to Anatolia. The British would continue to financially and militarily support the Ottoman Sultan. They wouldn't wish to have the French or Russian make further gains than what already occurred. But the Ottomans won't be maintaining a large Middle Eastern empire, thanks to Egypt. Previously, the Turkic Mamluks ruled Egypt, ruling as vassals of the Ottomans since their conquest. They were quite oppressive, as was detailed by US of Z in Part 1. Bonaparte's failed French invasion ousted the Mamluks, creating a power vacuum. This was filled by Muhammad Ali, who was the greatest heavyweight wrong guy. This Muhammad Ali was an Albanian who had taken power as Pasha of Egypt in 1805, nominally a subject of the Ottomans. He would enact effective modernization reforms and attack the Ottomans themselves later in his reign. In this new timeline, he will simply declare independence. The power disparity would be too great. He will attempt to conquer Anatolia and lead the Ottoman Empire himself, although the defensibility and British backing would hamper such efforts. He will still acquire Syria, however. A knock-on effect would be that the quasi-independent Ottoman dependencies in North Africa would also declare independence. The Europeans won't yet be able to capitalize on such a situation. It would be worth moving our focus to that area, particularly to France and Britain. Napoleon wanted to dominate Europe, ruling as emperor, with family members as client rulers. He won't be giving up on this ambition. It's debated whether he ultimately wanted a more federated system, or wanted to have the other nations act as French colonies for extraction. As previously mentioned, Napoleon continued to perpetuate ideals from the French Revolution, whose revolutionary government he assumed power from. The Napoleonic Code in particular was a civil code used to abolish prior feudal law, providing civil liberties, equality under the law, and also helped to secularize the state. These new administrative reforms were spread to French client states, such as in northern Italy, Germany, and also in directly controlled regions such as Croatia. These reforms were implemented throughout the continent by French civil servants. Some of these modernization reforms were desired by the people, such as in northern Germany, but sometimes they were opposed, such as in the case of southern Italy or Spain. This was quite unfortunate, given the British occupation of Sicily and the British support of Spanish rebels. In fact, the British opposition to Napoleon in Europe will stop him from pursuing further ambitions, such as trying to partition Iran with the Russians or taking India from the British. You see, the British will still remain a powerful and wealthy naval power in this new timeline. Bonaparte failed to invade mainland Britain historically due to their naval superiority. His answer was to establish the continental system. This was a trade embargo in which the British would not be able to export manufactured goods to European nations. Goods such as coffee, tea, spices, silk, cotton were manufactured much cheaper in Britain than in Europe, hence their exporting strength. This system would in theory severely damage the British economy, forcing them to sign a peace favourable to the French. The continental system eventually failed, because of the nations of Europe being too deprived of luxuries they had become accustomed to. Sort of like taking an iPad away from those iPad kids. The French unfairly avoided such deprivation themselves, breeding resentment. The Hanseatic trading cities of northern Germany were economically damaged, for example. The system bankrupted the puppet state of the Netherlands so severely that Napoleon's younger brother started trading with the British behind his back, leading to his forced abdication. Speaking more generally, policing the entire European coastline was unrealistic, given the strong incentives for trade. In this new timeline, the embargo is still going to put a strain upon Napoleon's subjects and allies. In our timeline, it was Russia who could no longer tolerate the strain of the system, leaving the agreement. This initiated Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia. This new timeline revolves around a Franco-Russian invasion of the Ottomans. As a way for the French to assuage Russian concerns over the continental system, this won't be tenable. I'm unfortunately going to have to ruin the scenario that Joseph Z has crafted. In part 1 of this collaboration, he outlines a French domination of the Adriatic Sea, allowing for the supply lines for an Ottoman invasion to remain secure. But British naval superiority won't be changing in the long run. They will re-establish dominance and maintain control of their Mediterranean islands. Perhaps the Ionian Islands next to the client kingdom of Greece will be lost, but this won't be changing the larger picture. And so, the British will move to blockade the city of Constantinople, in an effort to bring the Russians out of the continental system and away from the arms of the French. This would prevent the Russians from financially benefiting from the conquests they had made. They would have also incurred heavy costs from the invasion, and would still be dealing with the ramifications of the continental system. The British will simply request for the Russians to leave the continental system, an offer they will accept. Napoleon will be outraged, full of hubris and anger, to a greater degree than what caused the historical Russian invasion. He conquered Constantinople, and the Russians still stabbed him in the back regarding the continental system. In short order, Napoleon will declare war on Russia, too soon after the Ottoman War to address other concerns. His bicorn hat would be donned for yet another expedition. What could possibly go wrong? Napoleon's aim in the war would be to have the Russians rejoin the continental system, and to keep them in check through territorial acquisition. He would wish to capture Constantinople for himself, grant lands to Greece, and create a new Bulgarian kingdom. He would also wish to restore Polish lands to the Duchy of Warsaw. Bonaparte will first move quickly to recapture Constantinople with essentially the same army he used in the Ottoman War. The British blockade would be irrelevant, since land defences would be too weak for a successful naval defence to be effective. The Russians will be outraged and will meet the French directly in battle. Napoleon will crush them with his genius tactical ability. This rout won't cause the Russians to surrender, in the way many coalitions facing Napoleon were defeated. Russia couldn't financially handle rejoining the continental system, and wouldn't want to give up the great city they only recently conquered. They will instead retreat into the Russian heartland, and so Napoleon will follow close behind. They will replicate the same scorched earth tactics as they used towards the French historically, destroying anything useful for their army when moving from region to region. The terrain from Constantinople to Moscow won't be as brutal as the historical invasion route, yet the army will still dwindle with such tactics. The winter would be an important factor, but I believe the French won't have a pleasant time regardless. For example, I would question the capabilities of their armies. The current Grand Army of the French wouldn't be inexperienced with the Ottoman invasion, but it still wouldn't be a crack regiment. It primarily consisted of relatively new conscripts. This was also the case with the historical Russian invasion. They were literally trained while they were marching to join the rest of the army, with only basic drill and weapons training. Talk about learning on the job. This was not the methodical and well-crafted army that Napoleon desired. Napoleon's leadership often made a difference in key battles, but it won't be effective if the brutal attrition and lack of battles occurs in Russia. They're never going to be able to directly face the Russians. These reducing numbers would threaten his empire elsewhere. Take Spain, where the disastrous Peninsular War will still be occurring in this new timeline. Napoleon betrayed his loyal ally of Spain and installed his older brother onto its throne. Bonaparte believed that the Spanish would wish to be free of the harsh authority of the Spanish monarchy, Catholic Church, and oppressive privileged classes. He was wrong. Aside from a small class of educated middle-class peoples, most of the common folk were staunch supporters of these old institutions, and would fight a guerrilla campaign against the French, starting the Peninsular War in 1806. In 1807 he intervened directly, smashing the Spanish and British resistance. But when he left, incompetence and infighting would occur within the French military leadership. The war was a careless decision, coming from Napoleon's understandable arrogance. He did destroy numerous enemies repeatedly before, after all. The Spanish could have instead aided greatly in the planned invasion of Portugal. It was a bad call. The French in this timeline won't have enough resources to spare to send enough reinforcements to change the historical outcome. Napoleon's brother Joseph will still be deposed, and the Spanish and British will push the French out of the Iberian Peninsula. As it was historically, this will be thanks in large part to the leadership of Arthur Wellesley. He would later trounce Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's last battle, and be granted the title Duke of Wellington. Anyway, since the Peninsular War will have still been underway, the Latin American Wars of Independence against the Spanish Crown will prove successful. They were initiated in 1808. Speaking of the Americas, the United States of America will still be launching the War of 1812 in this new timeline. They were trying to conquer British American territory, while the British had their hands tied in Europe. But they failed to invade Canada, even before Britain would send further reinforcements in our own timeline. Even if reinforcements are delayed, it will still remain a British victory. Or a stalemate, according to the Americans. Back to the French, it's not only in Spain and Russia that they will falter. The failure of the continental system, and greedily acquired prosperity of the French, will cause irreconcilable resentments. The Austrians and Prussians were forced into alliances with the French after numerous crushing defeats. Napoleon attempted to assuage relations by marrying Marie-Louise, a Habsburg, the ruling family of Austria. But this new relationship was one of master and subject. Only a year before, the Fifth Coalition, which still happened in this new timeline, saw the Austrians create a reformed army, and in 1809 at the Battle of Wagram they were still smashed by the French. The Prussians chose not to join, fearing French strength.
But this loss won't stop the Austrians. Still holding a formidable army even after the defeat of the Fifth Coalition, the Habsburgs would cast a wary eye over Europe. Prussia, fueled by modernization efforts and eager to regain its footing, would find itself ready to take up arms once more. As we know, Prussians served in Napoleon's invasion of Russia in our own history. However, with a later invasion in this new timeline and a new, different route, the Prussians might not have to deal with the conundrum of contribution, as they had in our own history. As Napoleon continues his push eastward, the Austrians and Prussians would seize the opportunity, forming a new coalition with Sweden, lured by the promises of Norway, a price carved from the weakening grip of Denmark after Britain's merciless bombardment of Copenhagen. Britain too would of course join this coalition. Thus, a united coalition would once again rise against him. But this time the war is a slow, grinding struggle, with Napoleon bracing earlier for his invasion without the deadly bite of winter. It would not be a mere prelude to Waterloo, however. This final war delivers a peace so harsh, so unyielding, that Napoleon's empire can never rise again. Elba will not be the soft exile it once was. Emperor Napoleon's grip on Europe is over. In the aftermath, the borders of Europe will once again be redrawn. The Sixth Coalition, unlike its historical counterpart, achieved a brutal lasting peace. Russia, of course, would keep its prized Ottoman gains.
This wasn't like what happened historically, where the French and British worked together to keep Russian expansion into the Ottomans in check. The genie was already out of the bottle, and they wouldn't wish to fight a war with Russia, who would be adamant to keep their gains.
The Balkans becoming a chessboard divided, with Austria expanding its reach into lands such as Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania, fulfilling Tsar Catherine the Great's long-standing vision of a Russo-Austrian division of Ottoman Europe. However, the Byzantines would not rise from Constantinople's ashes as Catherine had so hoped. Instead, an independent Greece, which was already fully in rebellion during the initial conquest of Constantinople by Napoleon and Tsar Alexander, would emerge actually as a British-backed kingdom, not just because of its strategic position in the Mediterranean, but also due to the influence of Philhellenism in Britain's intellectual classes. And so the Ottomans would once again be forced to retract, consolidating their Anatolian heartland and awaiting the inevitable push for modernization from the now mighty liberal political class within. Elsewhere, Ottoman North Africa, nominally free by this point, falls quickly into the hands of the restored French kingdom. A brutal Algerian conquest and the Second French colonial empire spring into being. Egypt, of course a regional power under Muhammad Ali, would briefly taste independence, but the potential wealth from the Suez Canal would prove irresistible to European powers. British control, as in our own history, is almost certain. Speaking of Britain, the Empire, now a de facto referee in the volatile Balkans, would mediate disputes between Austria and Russia. With this newfound might, Austria no longer has a need for German unification, avoiding a costly conflict with Prussia, which in turn strides them right towards German unity. Austria's solidified grip on the Balkans would quell unrest, staving off Hungarian rebellions and preventing the need for a dual monarchy. Thus, Austria-Hungary, as we know it, will never exist.
Austrian and Russian control of the Balkans would also incentivize peaceful relations. There won't be new land to acquire, the powder keg of Europe would have diffused. World War I had started in our own timeline because of a dispute relating to an independent Serbia, backed by Russia but coveted by Austria-Hungary.
Make no mistake, the conditions for a world-shattering conflict would still remain, especially with the unbalance of power that would be brought on by Germany's unification. This would set the stage for a Europe teetering on the brink of a regional war. A canister full of unlit sparks of nationalism, imperialism, industrialization, and flaring crises that would refuse to let up. But let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this collaborative project, be sure to check out Part 1, which is featured on my channel, The US of Z. Be sure also to subscribe to History's Influence and check out his Patreon page linked in the description. Thanks for your time. This has been The US of Z, signing out.